The aim of our project is to bring together different strands of research from the typology of nominal classification systems, which include gender and different types of classifiers, the diachronic development of gender, which we believe can emerge from classifier systems, and psycholinguistic experiments, which can be carried out in rural communities. And we want to investigate if and how grammatical gender emerges from classifiers, and whether particular nominal classification systems are more optimal than others in terms of cognition. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Corbett Alexandra Grandison from the University of Surrey, along with our consultants and stakeholders, and in particular, a big thank you to Anne-Laure Dott from the University of New Caledonia for help with the fieldwork in New Caledonia. And of course, many thanks to the 121 participants across the 6 language communities of Vanuatu and New Caledonia. And fingers crossed, we get to go back soon. Now, the groupings of nouns known as genders are usually based on biological sex, as in Spanish or Russian. This is the majority choice. 3/4 of languages which have a gender system are of this type, but the other possibility is human versus non-human, or animate versus non-animate. The main point here is that gender systems don't need to be sex-based, and that's important for our story of how the classifiers we will be looking at fit into the wider picture of nominal categorization. Now, the assignment of nouns to gender can either be strictly semantic or a mixture of semantic and formal mechanisms. There's roughly a 50-50 split in the 2 types of assignment systems found in the languages with gender. And we claim that newer systems are semantic, and only later do formal assignment mechanisms develop. In the 19th century, there were big debates on the origin of gender based on Indo-European data. But as Proto-Indo-European already had gender, the origin of that gender system is shrouded in the mists of time. It wasn't until later that Greenberg discussed languages of Northern Australia, where additional gender distinctions developed from classifiers, which was essentially a semantic theory. We believe that Greenberg's hypothesis is correct, but then why would languages relinquish a semantically transparent and useful system of classifiers for a grammatical gender system that is both rigid and in part apparently unmotivated? And this brings us to our project investigating the possessive classifier systems of Oceanic. We needed languages which show the development of a new or emergent gender system within a set of closely related languages and with sufficient speakers for conducting psycholinguistic experiments. The languages chosen have a varying inventory size of possessive classifiers. They vary in the semantic opacity or transparency of classifier membership, so from classifiers with simple semantics to ones with complex semantics. They represent various stages of grammaticalization from noun to classifier to gender. So let's move on to Oceanic possession, which is where we find the classifiers we want to investigate. There are 2 types of possessive constructions in Oceanic, direct and indirect. That's a structural rather than a semantic distinction. They're roughly patterns with a semantic difference in alienability. So on the one hand, we have direct possession, and this is where the possessor marking attaches directly to the possessed noun, as shown in examples 1 here. Whereas in indirect possession, the possessor is marked on the classifier rather than the possessed noun. And these classifiers classify based on some semantic criteria, most of the time a relation that exists or is intended to exist between the possessor and possessed, but it can also be a property of the possessed noun. We assume a development of gender from noun to classifier to gender along a diachronic line here represented by this figure. And the first part of our client is the development of from noun to classifier. And this is best represented by Nêlêmwa, one of the languages in our sample. Now in 3a, we have the non-possessed noun wan, meaning boat. But if you want to talk about boats in a possessive construction, there's a directly possessed form that must be used, shown in 3b, which is wajan, meaning my boat. Now, however, there's an interesting development where the directly possessed form can be used as an incipient classifier, but only if the possessed noun appears with a modifier, such as knap, meaning sail. Now, these appositional phrases in 3c are precursors to classifiers. But what we found after working with different Nêlêmwa speakers, that there's huge variation in how these incipient classifiers function. So some people use them as described here. Now, other people use them, but without the modifiers, without any modification of the possessed noun. So they function like a classifiers for boats. But then others have larger semantic extensions associated. So one speaker uses wajan or waja as a transport classifier, which includes bicycles and cars. So what was before posited as a theory of diachrony of development of classifiers is actualized by the variation given by the speakers. Now, on the other end of the line, we have the development of classifiers into markers of gender. Now, in a canonical gender system, it's only one gender to a noun, and in the usual view of Oceanic possessive classifiers, there's a high degree of fluidity or overlap. Now, in Lewo, a noun can occur in different categories, classifier categories, dependent on how the possessor intends to use the possessed. So the noun we, meaning water, can occur with different classifiers, as shown in 4. But in North Ambrym, there's a much more rigid assignment of noun to classifier category. So the cognate for water, where, can only ever occur with the drinkable classifier and never with any other classifier. So the stricter assignment system in North Ambrym challenges the traditional view of classifier system, and it's a good argument for including possessive classifiers in a canonical view of noun categorization systems with gender at its core. Now, classifier and gender systems both work as means of categorization, which is a tool for understanding the world. Effective categorization systems need to be simple in order to minimize cognitive load, and informative to maximize communicative efficiency. And in reality, there's always a trade-off between these two principles. In our view, a simple system is one that has minimal classifier gender forms. An informative system has a one-to-one mapping of semantics to form. Now, we've designed a suite of experiments to test both the origin and the nature of noun categorization systems in Oceanic. So rather than just having one experiment that targets all parts of our research question, we've got several experiments which overlap on the aims and should give us supporting evidence for our claims, which will help in comparing these different and varying systems. Now, we aim to have 22 speakers per language for each of our field-based experiments, though in reality this did vary. And when designing the experiments, we had to take into account the different semantics of the classifiers across the 6 languages in our sample. And then analyzing the results. It's not just the results of one experiment in one language, but figuring out this complex interplay between the experiment results and all the languages is in the sample. And today I'm just going to be talking about the results from the first 2 experiments, free listing and video vignettes. So let's move on to our first experiment. Free listing is a very simple experiment where participants hear a classifier, then have 3 minutes to list as many nouns that are associated with it. Okay, so let's move on to our first hypothesis. We hypothesize that languages with more gender-like systems will have more nouns uniquely assigned to a classifier, whereas a system with which is more classifier-like is going to have the ability of nouns occurring with multiple classifier lists. So no, we haven't finished crunching the numbers for Iaai yet, so we only have 5 languages represented in the chart. Now, speakers from each language produce different total noun types and in different frequencies spread across the classifiers. So we've created a formula that takes into account both frequency of occurrence and the spread across the classifiers. Now, the results here are shown in percentages of unique nouns versus overlapping nouns. So nouns that only ever occurred with one classifier versus nouns that overlapped and were found in different classifier lists. And the number in brackets on the horizontal axis next to the language names are just a reminder of the inventory size of the classifier system. Now, what we can see here on the left-hand side of the figure is that North Ambrym has the highest number of nouns that only ever occurred with just one classifier list. So it had the most number of uniquely assigned nouns. Whereas on the right-hand side, Vatlongos and Nêlêmwa had the most number of larger numbers of nouns which overlapped and were given in different classifier lists. So the findings suggest that North Ambrym and Merei are more gender-like systems in terms of classifier noun assignment. So we get a nice client here from a more rigid assignment system on the left to a more fluid assignment system on the right. And so we have support for our first hypothesis. Another way of looking at the data is to look at the salience of an item given. So given a category label, participants produce typical rather than atypical examples. And salience can be determined by comparing the order of an item on an individual's list and the frequency of occurrence across all participants. And that was known as the Smith Salience Index. but a newer version of that called the Cognitive Salience Index has been created by Sutrop, and it basically gives you a value between 0 and 1, where more salient items score higher. Now, this CSI score is an improved version of Smith's salience. It doesn't take into account the length of a participant's list, so it gives more consistent results when list sizes vary across participants. This leads us on to our second hypothesis, and we think that languages with more gender-like assignment will have greater maximum salience. So in order to do that, we look at the nouns that have the greatest CSI scores across all the languages found in the languages in this, all the class, sorry, we looked at the nouns that have the greatest CSI scores across all the classifiers found in the languages in our sample. And that's called the maximum salience, and that's shown in the third column here. And what we can see here is that languages with larger inventories, such as Nêlêmwa and Ambrym, which are in the bottom two rows, have greater maximum salience scores, quite high here with 1 and 0.96 respectively, whereas languages with smaller inventory sizes of classifiers have smaller maximum salience scores. And we can also compare the mean salience of all the nouns that occur in the classifier category that has the greatest maximum salience in that language. The results roughly mirror those for the maximum salience score, so languages with larger inventory sizes have larger mean salience scores. Our results highlight the fact that languages with larger inventories, though, are more likely to include classifiers with highly specific semantics and a limited range of noun membership. Hence, we get larger maximum salience scores for these classifiers, as their membership will have little variation than most salience members. So on the whole, really, we only get partial support for our second hypothesis, as Nêlêmwa, which was previously classed as the most fluid system in terms of noun classifier assignment, also has the greatest salience here. But also Ambrym, with its more rigid system, also has a high maximum salience score as well. So only partial support here. So in summary, the free listing results point to a more rigid noun classifier assignment in Ambrym, which is hence more gender-like, and our maximum salience scores are greater for languages with larger classifier inventories, such as Ambrym. But also Nêlêmwa, which also has the most fluid classifier-like assignment system as well, also has the highest maximum salience found across any of the classifiers in all of the sample languages. Now, our second experiment are the video vignettes, and these are 24 different video clips which are created to test whether a noun can overlap with different classifiers dependent on different interactional contexts, which we'd expect in a typical classifier system, or if a noun can only occur with one classifier regardless of interactional context. The vignettes investigated just 3 main semantic categories: general, drinkable, and edible, which are reflected by the sample languages in different classifier categories. So for example, here we have Jake on the left, who is drinking his water, and we have Johnny on the right, who is washing with his water. And participants had to use a possessive construction to describe these different contexts to see whether the noun water would occur with different classifiers dependent upon the context. So here are the 3 main classifiers mapped out, and the vignettes tested target nouns by trying to evoke the different classifiers. So for example, do the target nouns such as water overlap and occur in different classifier categories based on the contextual interactions, or just one classifier regardless of the contextual interaction. We also investigate how particular systems react to more typical oppositions, for example, drawing on paper versus atypical interactions such as eating paper. And similarly here with the difference between eating and drinking eggs. This leads us on to our third hypothesis. So languages with more gender-like systems will show on average less overlap between the different interactions. That is, a noun in a gender-like system will not overlap with different classifier categories and will have a fixed assignment regardless of different interactional contexts. And what we can see here in this chart is the average overlap for each language. And the vertical lines here are the confidence intervals. So Ambrym has the least amount of overlap compared to the other languages in our sample. That is, nouns are more likely to be associated with just one classifier category than the other languages. And so North Ambrym here is significantly different from Lewo, Vatlongos, and Nêlêmwa. And that means they function quite differently. So again, the results point to North Ambrym as being the most gender-like with the least overlap. And a decline similar to that for the free list can be posited, with North Ambrym being the most rigid, with Nêlêmwa and Vatlongos being the most fluid in terms of noun classifier assignment. Move on to our fourth hypothesis. So in a well-behaved classifier system, we expect the semantics of the verb should match the semantics of the classifier. So we expect he drank his drinkable water and he washed with his general water. Whereas a more gender-like system should have a mismatch. So perhaps something like he washed with his drinkable water. So the mismatch here is between the more general semantics of the verb to wash and the classifier denoting drinkables. So we hypothesize that languages with more gender-like systems will show on average more semantic mismatch between verb and classifier. And what we get is that North Ambrym has the most semantic mismatches, again here shown on the left of the chart, and the results point to it being the most gender-like system in our sample again. The other languages function similarly, though Merei has the lowest average mismatch score, but the large variation in the results make it hard to separate from the other classifier-like languages as well. We can also tease apart our results by dividing the vignettes into typical and atypical reactions, as I discussed earlier. Now, all the languages have fairly high mismatches for atypical interactions, the ones shown in the salmon color here. And this showed us that the edges of the systems aren't purely semantic-based assignment, rather assignment is probably based on something else, perhaps frequency of interaction. But North Ambrym also has the highest semantic mismatches for typical interactions. So here we expect a well-behaved classifier systems to have lower amounts of mismatch. So again, North Ambrym stands out in that both typical and atypical interactions have more semantic mismatches than the other languages in the sample. Okay, so a quick summary of the video vignettes. So in terms of noun classifier assignment, North Ambrym has the least amount of overlap. It also has the highest amount of semantic mismatch in both typical and atypical interactions. And this points to North Ambrym having the most gender-like assignment system of all the languages is in our sample. And so to our conclusions, so far, the psycholinguistic experiments that we're conducting are shedding new light on the typology of nominal classification systems. So that is, we can fit oceanic systems into a larger canonical typology of nominal classification, ranging from classifiers with substantial overlap to the North Ambrym system, which is approaching a gender system in terms of noun classifier assignment. We can also track the diachrony of development of gender, and our results show how nouns can grammaticalize into classifiers, as shown by the data from Nêlêmwa, and then also how they become more rigid in their assignment, for instance, in North Ambrym, and in this respect, more gender-like. We're only at the beginning of our analysis, and we do hope to conduct further experiments in the field later this year or early next year. So hopefully we'll have some more results and more discussions coming up later. Thank you.